On our way to Corinth, Mississippi, we realized there was road construction ahead, so we decided to take back roads. That's where you always find the coolest stuff, and today we found a really good one, the Confederate Soldiers' Home. This is a fascinating place. There's a visitor center, of course, but first we're going to check out this Confederate cemetery, which is different from most. Jefferson Manley Faulkner, officer in Confederate Army and founder of the Confederate Soldiers' Home of Alabama, born July 14th, 1843, died May 18th, 1907. The soldiers buried here are the ones who survived the war and went on to live out the rest of their lives. This is cemetery number 2. J.H. Watt, L.B. Lentz, J.G. Dean, C.P. Wyckoff, F.N. Robertson, W.H. Rowe, W.M. Bell, W.M. Rhodes, J.H. Fleming, J.M. Kennard, S.V. Shepherdson, W.N. Elbrock, E.F. Wheeler, John Lewis, J.D. Simmons, D.W. Coram, C.M. Green, Captain Company 5, Arkansas Infantry, Daniel Gore, C.N. Strickland, H.L. Shirley, J.W. Butler, J. Walker, J.T. Bolt, Mrs. A.B. Jones, and A.B. Jones. Each of these has There's a Mrs. up here. Oh, here she is. Mary Elizabeth, December 30, 1919. Wife of Private Augustus B. Jones, CSA. Does not have a birth date.
Yeah, some of the dates are sketchy. Like this one here. There's a date of death, there's no date of birth. And I don't know, some have a cross and some have this little, like an iron cross with a wreath is what it looks like.
Tell me what that is in the comments.
Maybe you can ask the museum guy.
George H. Henning, February 1st, 1843 to November the 23rd, 1920. Member of Dance's Battery, enlisted 1861, paroled at Appomattox 1865. Blessed are they that die in the Lord.
Amen.
And Stacey just said, it's like, if you compare this, look at this cemetery. I mean, it's beautifully maintained, just beautifully maintained. Now compare this to the burial trenches at Shiloh, the mass graves that the Confederate dead were just unceremoniously tossed into. Polk Murray died April 28th, 1921. Age 77. B Brigade.
Oh, this is a Southern Cross, this shape. Southern Cross of Honor, and I'm gonna bet that's some kind of Latin. Deo Vindis, what is that, God? Wine dice, I don't know what Vindis says, we'd have to Google it.
A.S. Bryant, 3rd Alabama Regiment, February 3rd, 1833 to April the 5th, 1921.
Oh, Deo Vindis was the national motto of the Confederate States of America. It appears on the margin beneath the device of the seal of the Confederate States.
Cool.
So to me, it's Latin for "with God as our protector." That's Deo Vindis.
T.A. Lashley, December 27th, 1838, April 1st, 1921. Company F, 6th North Carolina Volunteers. God be with you till we meet again. Eli Guthrie, D.A. Williams, J.G. Allen, Ellen M., April 7th, 1930, no birth date, wife of Private John R. Green, CSA.
There's a few unknown soldiers here, which would also be a question like...
The unknown soldiers. The men whose families never knew what became of them. They never came home.
There's a symbol, it's like kind of a fancy cup. And
Oh,
like a regular
yeah.
cup, and they're shaking hands.
W.M. Watt, CSA, Company E, 2nd Battalion, Alabama, Light Artillery. Died November 22nd, 1923, aged 80 years. Yeah, I don't know. Good question for the visitor center. Michael H. Smith, Private, 65 Alabama Infantry, Confederate States Army, March 21st, 1925. Robert Booker Wingo, Private Company A, 2nd Alabama Cavalry, Confederate States Army, April 13th, 1925. And the list goes on and on. The symbols we're finding on the gravestones have significance to the individual buried in the grave rather than the Confederacy. These men died at an old age, and private individuals bought the stones. Wait a minute. I saw him in the museum. I think I saw his picture. Isaac Newton Henson, Private Company G, 16th Alabama Infantry, Confederate States Army, December 29th, 1842, September 1st, 1925.
I just know from Shiloh, when you see these memorials that have stacks of cannonballs, that means a soldier has died.
Now we enter the museum.
This was captured during Pickett's charge.
I haven't been to all of them, but in my experience, this is the best museum I've ever seen because it shows a broader scope of the soldiers' lives, not just on the battlefield and immediately after, but years later. We move on through this museum packed with an overload of information.
Here's all Hardy's tactics.
Ooh. Remember we talked about this at Shiloh? Hardy's tactics. Both sides use this. On display here is ordnance of every kind. From the straightforward to the nasty.
Obviously, I cannot.
Did you see this hook? That's the kind of bayonet that you would use to drag bodies to the burial pits.
Ooh.
This is just plain gruesome.
It's my first time seeing one of those. Obviously, I cannot show you everything. Just give you an overview because it's like trying to read the Encyclopedia Britannica to you. I'm loving these little pistols. This relic was found near Gravelly Springs, Alabama, at the 1865 winter headquarters site of U.S. General H.J. Wilson. In April 1865, Wilson led 13,000 troops in a raid across Alabama.
After fiddling a little bit with this interactive station, I realized what it was. It showed the movements of troops during the war.
My favorite has always been the pistol.
It's interesting to see the difference between weapons dug up at battlefields as opposed to ones that have been taken care of over the years. This museum has a lot of this sort of thing. This museum has a progression, and now we begin to move toward later years.
It's a slide.
Oh,
It's called a magic lantern. And it was the first slide projector.
oh, that is cool.
So this rear lantern slide was made by the War Photograph and Exposition Company for a magic lantern show in 1890. The slide was made from an original Brady wet plate negative portrait of General Lee taken in Richmond, Virginia, just after the end of the war in 1865.
Wow,
That's the porch of his house.
that is amazing.
These magic lanterns were all the rage in the late 1800s.
That is the coolest thing I have seen in a museum. Like, it's so not like everything else.
Enter the history of the Confederate Soldiers' Home. It sits in the center of the 102-acre Confederate Memorial Park and is the site of Alabama's only Confederate Veterans Home. By 1900, Alabama had more than 2,000 survivors of the Southern armies. Many of them were old and infirmed or disabled from the war. At least 100 were living in county poorhouses. None of them received a government pension for obvious reasons. Toward the end of the 1800s, efforts began to care for these indigent soldiers, many of which had no family. These efforts began in Virginia, Louisiana, and Arkansas.
I really like this museum. It's different because it's like, well, that's that one, that's really cool. But also it's like the Confederates' home. Like, this was basically a retirement village built for destitute soldiers.
Yeah, so you'll see photos of young soldiers and then the same soldier like in old age. It's
Right.
kind of like a whole story of their whole life, like not just the end of the war, but like how they lived into the 20s and 30s.
That is fascinating because you never hear about that.
Jefferson Manley Faulkner, a Montgomery attorney and Confederate veteran, was determined to help his brothers in arms. Through tireless efforts, he was able to found the Alabama Confederate Soldiers' Home. Stacey and I would have never known about this place had we not avoided construction on the highway and taken a back road. This gold mine of Confederate post-war history.
The battle-torn, blood-stained regimental colors passed in solemn review.
This is interesting.
Histories of the war began to be written even before the outcome was determined. On display are two of the earliest versions, one authored by a Southerner and the other by a Northerner. As one might expect, their interpretations of the war vary a great deal.
Joint reunion and the reunion it is we will hold so long as there are 7 members.
The following is just as relevant today as it was then.
Alabama's Confederate veterans accepted the outcome of the war. They were just as desirous, however, that an impartial history of their story would be told. During Reconstruction, Confederate veterans formed charitable associations in order to hold social gatherings with former comrades. These charitable associations eventually led to the formation in 1889 of the United Confederate Veterans. By that time, wartime animosities had cooled so that the establishment of such a society did not raise undue concern in the North.
may be up here this evening. No? I want another.
So these were bottles that were found on the site, right?
Ooh.
So most date between 1900 and 1930s. So they would drink Cokes, and they might have a tummy ache, so they would have milk and magnesia.
That is so cool.
Like, you don't think about just kicking back with a Coca-Cola.
No.
I don't know, it's really fascinating.
This is really interesting because a lot of these effects in here, it actually shows you the person who owned it. Instead of just being some random thing that a soldier owned, you see who actually owned it.
Theodore Roosevelt.
Oh.
This is the residence of Mountain Creek, and most probably a soldier's home from his train car. So remember you saw the train tracks.
Yeah. That is cool.
The museum contains many pictures of the now long gone cottages the veterans lived in.
So this Confederate's home, retired veterans home, wasn't just like an institution. They had these really nice cottages that they could live in, and it was provided for them by the institution because many of them, if not most of them, were destitute because the South was absolutely, left in a shambles after the war. But it's interesting. This whole thing is very, very, very different from other museums we have seen. It's a completely different thing. This is like really fascinating. The only problem with it is there's so much information that you can't take it in. You just can't take it in.
So this is kind of an exhibit about how Confederate veterans and their descendants have distinguished themselves, fighting for America since the war between the states.
Yes.
And it starts at the top with Private John McClurkin, who was in the 3rd Alabama Cavalry. It lights up.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Then his grandson fought in World War II. And then his great-grandson fought in Vietnam. Oh, look how cute he is. And he really resembles, like you can see the resemblance. He got the same ears. They all have the same ears.
Yeah, because their descendants fought for America.
Exactly. So they deserve some respect.
They deserve some respect. This is a hill I will die on.
Me too.
A great many soldiers of the Southern armies embraced the Union after the war, and they went on to support it militarily, serving in the Army, and their descendants as well. And there's this.
This is so important. Zoom in. a little bit, and you can see them shaking hands. Men who wore the blue and men who wore the gray are here together, a fragment spared by time. All of them we honor, not asking under which flag they fought, thankful that they stand together now under one flag. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1938, Gettysburg Peace Monument dedication.
Look at these excerpts from the pension applications.
He was a brave and good soldier. He was one of the best fighters in the Southern Army, a great forager and
Confederate.
He was one of the best fighters in the Southern Army, a great forager and inveterate prankster. When there was any fighting, you could count on him as being at his post and nobly doing his duty. I have more Yank bullet marks on me than any other old Reb in Bibb County today. At Gaines Mill, I was surrounded by the enemy, but escaped by laying down between two dead soldiers. So you want to see some of the outside stuff?
Join us next time where we walk the grounds.